Welcome to Deutsches Haus at NYU. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here, or as I like to say, I'm the executive intern, because it's pretty much the same story. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the extreme gun mainstream commercialization and far-right youth culture in Germany and the US. This is, of course, partially the title of a book by Cynthia Miller-Idriss, and if you haven't seen it, we have it outside. Here you go, and it is for sale for $20. You should buy it if you don't have it already, because it is very insightful. The book doesn't have the question mark in the title, and perhaps that's a question to ask Cynthia about later. In any case, so Cynthia will speak about her book, and Cynthia is, of course, Cynthia Miller-Idriss, and she will be introduced in more detail later by my wonderful partner in crime from the University of Cologne, New York office, Eva Bosbach, who is the executive director of the University of Cologne, New York office here in New York. And she will introduce Cynthia Miller-Idriss and also Hanjo Berressem, who is the second speaker of tonight's evening. And he is currently our DAAD visiting scholar, but he is originally and still affiliated, of course, with the University of Cologne. So welcome to Deutsches Haus at NYU. This is your first event here with us as part of being our DAAD visiting scholar. And welcome back, Cynthia. It's great to have you here. I'm so glad you can give this talk here at Deutsches Haus. And I remember our first meeting with Eva. And I just want to tell a little story, because I was just in Germany myself several weeks ago, and I could read a situation in a very different way thanks to Cynthia's book and thanks to our conversation, because I found myself in a Regionalbahn, in a regional train in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and I entered an Abteil, or a car, and I felt it was a very strange atmosphere. There were a lot of young people, and the men all wore bizarre haircuts. From my point of view, it reminded me of a film from the 30s, like a little longer here, very short underneath. And they were wearing really strange T-shirts. And when I looked more closely, I recognized some of the rune symbols that Cynthia had told me about when we met. And I realized that I was in a Zugabteil with some right-wing young people, and it was a very strange moment, and felt a little scary, and I look forward to understanding this a little better based on your talk and based on Hanjo's thoughts and the general discussion we'll all have together after Hanjo and Cynthia have spoken. So in other words, I'm saying this is real. Of course, I knew it was real, but I hadn't seen it myself. I'd only seen it in pictures, and now I had the general awareness to be able to locate these T-shirts and their secret or not so secret code in a way. So thanks for helping me read this situation. Having said that, I also would like to thank the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for supporting our academic events. I would also like to thank Heiko Schwarz, who is here from the German Consulate General tonight, who will also give a few welcoming remarks. And I would like to thank you for coming, for being interested in this very timely and important topic. And of course, it's not only relevant for Germany, but the right-wing youth culture is also a phenomenon we see in other countries and also in this country. So thanks for joining us. Please make sure to switch off your cell phones. Please be aware that this event is being filmed. If you don't want to be filmed or photographed, now is the time to leave, as you might have recognized already. And afterwards, you'll have a chance to ask questions, and we will, after the official part of the event is over, have an opportunity to speak with each other and speak with the speakers outside over a glass of wine. And now, one thing I forgot is to thank my wonderful colleagues and staff, Sarah, our interns, Katrin and Emily, our photographer, John, Laia, and Isabel, who are taping the event. You always have to thank the people you work with. So if you don't do it, you should be doing it. Well, now help me join welcoming our speakers and Eva Bosbach now. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Juliane, for this warm welcome to the Deutsches Haus at NYU. Also, on behalf of the University of Cologne and its New York office, I would like to welcome you all here. My name is Eva Bosbach. I am the executive director of that office. I would like to tell you just a little bit about the University of Cologne. You might know Cologne for its very famous cathedral, the Cologne Cathedral. You might also know the University of Cologne, which is one of the leading German research universities. In fact, it is one of only 11 German so-called universities of excellence. We are also one of the oldest universities in Europe. The University of Cologne has been founded already 1388 and is also currently the largest German university. We have almost 50,000 students. The University of Cologne holds representative offices in China, India, and in North America, here in New York. And we're very happy that tonight Christiane Biel is here, who is in charge of the partnerships with North American universities. She is here just this week. So if you would like to partner with the University of Cologne, please speak to Christiane later at the reception. Thank you for being here tonight. The big thank you, of course, goes to Juliane and her team. Thank you for partnering with us for this event, and thank you for sharing the vision with us to foster transatlantic exchange and collaboration and dialogue. Dialogue is also the form that we chose for tonight's event. So in the next step, I would like to introduce the two speakers. So Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a professor of education and sociology at the American University in Washington, D.C. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. Her primary research focuses on the cultural dimensions of radical and extreme right youth subcultures and school-based responses to radical and extreme youth engagements. Her most recent book is The Extreme Gone Mainstream, Commercialization and Far-Right Youth Culture in Germany. And Cynthia also frequently writes for mainstream audiences on issues of youth, radicalization, education, nationalization, parenting. Most recently, she wrote for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, the Salon, and the Fortune. I would also like to mention that from 2013 to 2014, Cynthia worked on this book as part of her fellowship at the Morphomata International Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Cologne. So thank you, Cynthia, for coming from Washington and introducing your book to us. And I would also like to introduce to you Professor Hanjo Berressem, who came from Cologne to us. So he's professor of American Studies at the University of Cologne. He is also the speaker of the Center for Media Studies and a member of our Artes graduate school. His academic interests include contemporary American fiction and media studies. He has recently finished 2 complementary book manuscripts, one on Gilles Deleuze, which he called Crystal Philosophy, and the other on the notion of eigenvalue, which he called Crystal Science. Professor Berressem is currently on the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, visiting scholarship here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and he is here until October. So we are very happy that he can join us tonight to have the dialogue with Cynthia. And it is now my great honor to hand over to Consul Heiko Schwarz, who is head of the political department of the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany here in New York, for his welcoming remarks. Have a great evening, everyone.
Good evening. When I got the invitation to come tonight, I was asking myself, tonight's topic sounds a bit contradictory. How can the extreme go mainstream? I mean, by definition, being extreme means to be on the fringe. However, reality has overtaken us, and cities like Charlottesville or Chemnitz recently have shown us that extremism has a mainstream face and it has an ugly face. Unfortunately, the things that happened there are by no means single occurrences. There are many cities I could mention, not only in the US or in Germany. It looks like there's a tendency in our society towards oversimplified and falsified messages, fake news and fake news, and all those are carried by fear and by hatred, and that's what extremism, what makes it so dangerous and so difficult to grasp. The UN General Assembly is starting soon, and there were many policymakers visiting last week and those weeks, and we were talking a lot about Chemnitz and about all those occurrences, and what was impressive was that many of them are still struggling. They try to grasp it, they don't have answers, and actually we need people with answers. That's why I find this evening tonight so important, and I'm really looking forward to learn about your insights, Cynthia. I mean, some extremists hide behind the message, but we are the good guys. We are talking today about the extreme right, but in my opinion, any kind of extremism that devalues other persons has no right. I mean, there's no right to hate. Democracy is built upon the rule of law, not upon the rule of the mob, as we have seen. And that's why I'm really curious to hear what you have to say. I'm going to buy your book. I haven't bought it yet, so I'm already hooked. No. I buy it. And one thing I want to say is understanding the mechanism is, for me, only the first step. I am encouraged to see all you here. I think the very important second step is taking action. We are all diverse in our beliefs and in our convictions, and that's okay. But for this very reason, because of our diversity, we as a society as a whole need to stand up for our common core values. And extremism is not, although it seems like to be mainstream, these are not, it's not the majority. I think there's a silent majority and they need to find their voice. So thank you to Deutsches Haus at NYU. Thank you to the University of Cologne to have invited me, and thank you for you to being here. I now hand over to Hanjo Berressem and wish you an excellent evening.
Okay, hi, welcome again. Welcome for coming out this evening. And don't worry, I've been introduced as a second speaker. I'm not really the second speaker. This is the final thing you have to endure before we get to the main course, which is Cynthia, because that's why we're all here. We're all carrying this book as a kind of badge of honor. It's a really good book. Also, I'll make this very short. Thanks again to Juliane, Sarah, and Eva, and of course again, sort of Cynthia. Just a couple of words, 2 pages, not much, about the book and about how sort of we all got here. So it's equally a pleasure and an honor to be part of this event. And 6 years ago, when she and I were fellows at the Morphomata Center of Excellence at the University of Cologne, I attended a talk Cynthia gave about her now finished project at Morphomata. And I'm delighted to have the chance to later on discuss Cynthia's work with her, as well as with, and let me say this immediately, with all of you. Right? When we talk, it might be a conversation, but please enter this conversation because you might have more intelligent questions. Probably you all have more intelligent questions than the ones I'm going to ask. Also, I very fondly remember the Morphomata Center of Excellence, which perhaps we can also talk about a little bit more during the conversation after Cynthia's talk today, especially in terms of what her stay there meant for her work. And about Cynthia's talk in Cologne, I vividly remember, and I do remember how impressed, intrigued, and also astonished everyone in the room was, and we were mostly German people in the room, about the results of her research, because someone from America knew so much more about a German subculture, or probably one has to say culture by now, somewhere in between, subculture, culture, mainstream, extreme. We just heard about that kind of gray area that we have, then all of us Germans in the audience combined. So it's a real pleasure to see her again today with the finished work. I'll do this. It's not mine, so I can do this shamelessly. Every time I sort of will have the sort of can do that. Okay. At that Monday evening in Cologne, we all felt how helpful and how healthy, and I really mean this in a kind of a cultural health notion, it was to have someone from outside of Germany reflect upon and throw into focus a topic that seemed so much to lie at the heart of a specifically German experience. But the German experience is by now a global experience, and we all feel that every day, at least in what we still call, perhaps falsely, the West. Because the West is not, is much more, again, sort of, it reaches out into the complete whole world. And that Monday, Cynthia's transatlantic view allowed for a novel and important perspective. Here was a gaze that probed deeper into the dynamics of a subcultural movement that had been going on for a long time and that we felt was awaiting precisely Cynthia's critical gaze. Because for me, and for most Germans, I presume, a number of younger people here, and for those people it might be a little bit sort of, it might still be new that there was a history to that, because I presume for most Germans of my age, fashion and coolness always belonged to the left and not to the right. Internationally, there were Che Guevara posters and T-shirts, there were Arafat shawls, which became popular in the United States in the late 80s with bohemians, punks, and the hipsters. There was Intifada and Antifa fashion. Probably many of you remember this, right? 68, all of this. Closer to home in Germany, there was Jim Lee's photograph called Bader Meinhof from 1969, in which an elegantly dressed model carries a submachine gun in place of a handbag. And later there was what fashion critics in America called terrorist chic, Prada Meinhof, or Red Army fashion, which are puns, of course, on Bader Meinhof, that's Prada Meinhof, and Red Army Fraction, die Rote Armee Fraktion, with Red Army fashion. And you can see today that already there we have the same sort of things in punning and sort of having fun also, a very scary kind of fun with politics and sort of violence. So we'll see today that this strategy of punning is also a central strategy for the right, and that's what you have basically sort of shown us. At the same time, the German magazine Tussi Deluxe featured, it's been back on recently, featured a photo spread of terrorist models or models dressed as terrorists, lying in a pool of blood, advertising slippers. And this fashion of the left is already cultural history, and it is academically well rehearsed. In terms of fashion, one might say that it is slightly passé or out of style, curiously retro. Cynthia's research, in contrast, is extremely hip and certainly as well as scarily up to date, because I think we all feel a kind of scariness running under what we are talking about today. What Cynthia is interested in is a much more invisible and much more less academically rehearsed parallel universe. Fashion on and off the right. Fashion worn by what has been called, and here's another portmanteau word game or pun, nipsters, which are Nazi hipsters. Right? And all of this, again, sort of, is funny, but it's also extremely scary, right? So, like Roland Barthes in his book, The Fashion System, Cynthia approaches that fashion as a complicated science system, as a both political and a cultural text, a both material and immaterial semiotics with its own complicated grammar and semantics. Cynthia links this semiotics of clothing to another Barthian concern, which is myth, and probably we can also talk about this later on in the Q&A. Like Barth, Cynthia reads alt-right fashion as part of what purports to be a mythical system, but is in fact, like all mythical systems, a political system. Chinos and white shirts, combat boots, and hoodies with weird, often enigmatic symbols, worn like a uniform and with more or less political conviction. As you define it, quote, the emergence of a high-quality, commercialized products laced with far-right extremist codes, what you experienced in the Regionalexpress, right? In fact, quote again from you, absent the coded symbols, the new brands in the far-right scene are virtually indistinguishable in style from other clothing popular with youth. And this is indeed fashion, mainstream with a neo-Nazi twist. And we all have to be careful and look at our own clothing. I'm known to wear Fred Perry. And that is kind of scary now to see that Fred Perry is more than just a tennis player, right? British. Huh. You know, you have to take care nowadays. Which codes am I wearing? What message am I sending? So what is it about the fashion of the neo-Nazis and the alt-right? How to read their dress code? What message on the jacket? And what are the inroads by which that fashion allows the extreme to enter the mainstream? What, in the beautiful title for today, the extreme, you have it in there, right? The EA extreme of this, our sort of event. What is the vector from extreme then to mainstream? The right fashion, the right way to wear it. This is now also ambiguous, the right way to wear things. And also, what is the story of Cynthia's project? How did it come about? Your own journey. You start the book with a vignette of yourself in Berlin, observing a store that sells neo-Nazi fashion. Right? How did you get there? I don't mean the sort of the subway line. I mean academically. What brought you to this point, right? To stand there in Berlin at a specific time, looking at that sort of store. And with that question, I hand the microphone happily over to Cynthia, who can and will also, just saying that, you will answer all those questions. Cynthia, thanks for doing this event, and thank you for having done this important book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Eva and Juliana and all of the hosts, University of Cologne and Deutsches Haus, NYU. I was a faculty member here for a decade, so it feels very much like a homecoming to be back here and to see students, former students, doctoral students, friends, and new colleagues as well here. So it's a particular pleasure. And to be back with Hanjo, who I was a fellow with what feels like just a year or two ago, but suddenly now also 6 years ago. So my goal is to speak quite quickly, not too quickly, but rather briefly. I'll try to keep this to about 15 to 20 minutes, which is less than a normal length of a book talk, so that we have most of our time for conversation, and really want to start by talking about sort of how the question that Hanjo left us with, which is where did this come from, right? How did I stumble on this, which is the way that I think of myself as having fallen into the project. But there are two things I want to say first. One is that there are a number of offensive images. This is an image-based project, and I think that that shouldn't go unsaid. I apologize for that. I think it's hard to explain what the images, what the clothing looks like without showing some of the coding. I haven't included the most offensive ones here, but they are offensive anyway, and they should offend. And I take the Anti-Defamation League's perspective on that, which is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but I also think it should be acknowledged that they are not easy to look at always, and I apologize for that. And the second thing I want to say is that I'm keenly aware that I'm an outsider to Germany. I'm an American mucking around in one of the darkest corners of contemporary life and history. And in that way, I want to be very cautious about what that means to be an American in this context and to be having this conversation. It wasn't a book I intended to write, and I'll explain that. I mean, it was a project that took hold of me and wouldn't let me go. But I also have spent a quarter century living in and around Germany. It was my major as an undergraduate. I moved to Germany in 1992, just at the moment of several terrible attacks on asylum seekers, and began studying at the University of Hamburg in that moment when it was a large part of the conversation. I then later moved to Berlin to study the vocational school system at another moment of wave of right-wing attacks, and I was working in a construction trade school that I later studied for this book, when teachers were deeply embedded in conversations about how to combat the far right. And so over a course of a quarter century, it became very much a dominant theme for me. And one of the things I learned is that Germany has, by far, hands down, the greatest and deepest infrastructure in place to combat the far right. And so for Americans now, I think, and others who are struggling with this issue in our schools and our universities, I think it's a moment for a more transatlantic dialogue than ever before on this issue. So I think that's important to acknowledge and to just say that it's a conversation about something that we all need to solve rather than an expose on a dark corner of another country's history and contemporary life. So how did this begin? I wrote an earlier book based on those construction trainees and other trainees in vocational schools that delved into the issue of the far right, because that's what teachers were dealing with. And in 2009, I went back to Berlin for a conference, and my editor at that time said, hey, while you're there, could you look for a photograph, see if there's anything that might be good for the cover of the book? So I went to an archive that I had worked with before, an anti-fascist archive in Berlin, and those archivists put me in touch with 3 professional photographers who track the far right at public events throughout Germany, marches and concerts and festivals and all kinds of situations where the far right is publicly present. And those 3 photographers gave me access, unrestricted access to tens of thousands of photographs in their archives, tracking the far right over 10 years. And I sorted through those photographs, starting to look for a cover photo for the book. And of course, I had been familiar working in vocational schools with construction trainees, particularly where there are at-risk youth and youth engaged in the far right. I was familiar with the aesthetics of the far right scene in Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s, where what you mostly saw are things that you were probably also familiar with shaved heads and combat boots and bomber jackets. But as I started to look through their professional photographs, I began to see other kinds of photographs cropping up from about the mid-2000s, in this set of tens of thousands of photographs that had a lot of one brand, which I'll talk about later, but then brighter colors, different kind of iconography, different kind of script, more mainstream kinds of styles. I started looking into this a little further and discovered there were other brands. There were ways in which they were using messages that were not as easy to detect or understand, like a reference to Reconquista. It says Spirit of 1492, and that's the name of a Spanish pogrom against Muslims in the 15th century. There were some messages that were not hard to detect at all or understand at all on a women's shirt. There were brands that were cut across other kinds of subcultural scenes, like mixed martial arts, or that had a different type of mainstream style, different type of appeal, but that were still using, this is a brand called Ansgar Aryan, right? Ansgar Aryan, using the word Aryan in the name, patriotic ink. And they were making contemporary references. So this T-shirt says, "Send them back," and on the back it says, "Fortress Europe, illegals go home." In English, which again I will explain, but one of the things I want to point out here, this sells for 29.99 euros, right? It's a 30-euro T-shirt, about $35. Very high quality, well-made, well-constructed, nice stitching, professionally done. A radical change from the kinds of products that one would see at far-right festivals previously, which were kind of screen-printed T-shirts, made in somebody's garage and sold out of the back of a station wagon or something in the US anyway, or its equivalent on a folding table. So a radical, radical shift. So I have to say it was hands down the most affirming experience I've had as an academic, because I came back from that archive trip thinking I'll write an article about this, and then it just wouldn't let me go. Like, for the first time in my life as an academic, I woke up in the middle of the night, blinking at the ceiling, thinking about this, and wanting to know how it was working. And that was then, you know, the next 8 years of my life, which also made my kids come to Germany and learn German and go to school for a year. And we went 5 trips. I mean, they went to kindergarten and 2nd grade in Germany. There were all kinds of consequences personally as well as professionally. But I think they still go to Deutsche Schule every Saturday. So, you know, it's hopefully a gift. And if not, they'll be in therapy. But you know, they have had to tolerate this obsession as well. But in any case, I built a digital archive. The IT specialist who helped me build that archive is in the back, so lots of friends here. Thank you, John. 3,000 images in the end, but had to be sorted and held on a server so that a coder in Berlin could help me work with those. And then got funding to go back to 2 Berlin schools for construction trades and conduct interviews. I conducted 62 interviews. 51 were with students. Those other 11 are not analyzed systematically. That are with teachers and principals about how they deal. And I won't go into the data that much here, but I'm happy to talk about that, especially in conversation that year in Morphomata, where it was a group of fellows studying images and figurations, and that was the year that really helped me understand how to work with images in a way that was different than the way I had been trained as a sociologist, because these were mostly humanities scholars. And so a very meaningful year methodologically for me. So briefly, I just want to say something about what others have said. I was interested in this initially as a cultural sociologist, right? I was fascinated by this use of the codes, the way they were manipulating the meaning of symbols in the T-shirts, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And I was interested because, you know, what most scholars have said about symbols as they relate to social movements and political action is that symbols are tools, but they don't have their own autonomous power. They can be used by somebody to help support, but they don't actually motivate action. And similarly, economic objects, by sociologists anyway, other scholars have probably done a better job of this, but sociologists have largely looked at economic objects and material culture as something derivative of other things, right? So Marx is the classic example who says, you know, economic objects are the end point in a system of unequal production that sets up exploitation, but they don't have power on their own to motivate people. And in my work, I will make the argument, and I argue in the book, that this is exactly what symbols are doing. They are motivating extremist behavior. They are helping constitute identity. They are not just reflective and derivative. They have power, and they have to be understood as powerful. Empirically, previous work on extremism, mostly, with some exceptions, focuses on formal, organized political parties and social movements. And I am part of a group of scholars, and Vrag Molnar is another who works on Hungary. She's in the back here. There are some other scholars who do this as well, but fewer and far between, who have looked at the far right as a cultural space and tried to understand it as a space in which cultural things happen and where culture can motivate action. And ultimately, what I argue in the book is that what you can learn from the way the clothing works is that the far right is not just a structural or an ideological space, but also an emotional one and a cultural one. And I think that has become much clearer in the light of the kinds of elections that we've seen over the last few years. But at the beginning of this project, that was much less clear. So it makes more sense now, I hope, to other people, but it was a harder sell in the beginning when I was trying to get funding. But we can talk about that later. Really quickly, just a couple of things about the early commercialization. Of course, there was always in the far right in Germany some early commercialization, both in the kind of Nazi kitsch, you know, souvenir items, but also in the 1980s, this is what you were typically seeing in the far right scene in the US as well, you know, kind of stickers and bumper stickers with coded symbols that were sold in maybe a paper brochure, maybe out of the back of a car on a stadium, but not well-made quality, not mainstream style. And all of that changed radically when these brands came on the market that started to sell very high quality mainstream clothing with sophisticated references, both on sophisticated websites, but using things like a logo that combines 2 banned runic symbols that were used by the Nazi Party into a new logo. there were many court cases. There were many cases where states tried to prevent that logo from being used. That's a whole other story. But what's sort of interesting is that the company won all of the cases on a semiotic argument that the combination of two banned symbols creates a new symbol which no longer directly references the banned organization. So for all of you cultural scholars out there who thought semiotics doesn't really matter in real life, I mean, this is a perfect example of where it really does matter. And this is the kind of stuff that's happening with the courts on trying to figure out how this coding works and what is legal and what is not legal. There are, for the biggest brand that's selling this stuff, Thorsteiner, has physical storefronts now across Europe, across Eastern Europe. I think there are 12 in Moscow alone. They have steel and glass entryways and fake bamboo flooring and boxwoods at the register and all kinds of mainstream style things that don't resonate with the kind of way in which far-right products were sold in the past. They market resistance, which is one of the chapters of the book. I talk about that. They use historical references like this T-shirt that says Wüstenfuchs, which means desert fox, which those of you who know little World War II history might recognize that as the nickname of Erwin Rommel, who commanded the Nazi troops in North Africa. But it deliberately exists in what one of my interviewees called the gray zone, which means, and he said, I have that shirt in my closet when I showed a whole bunch of images of clothing. He said, if I wear it on the street, a little old lady might think, oh, a cute gray fox, but somebody else might know what I meant, right? So this deliberate kind of playing of meaning and what the line is. And this is hard, sorry, the image is a little small to see, but also deliberate playing with the legality of this. So this jacket, again, priced at something like 76 euros, so again, not cheap, has the Danish word swastika across the back of it, which, of course, where in the States, you'll recognize that as similar to the English word swastika. But the German word for swastika, which many of you know, is Hakenkreuz. That would be illegal if it were on the back, right? You could not put the word Hakenkreuz across, but by putting it in another language, that dates back to a 2011 ruling by the highest German court that ruled that if Nazi signs are in a language other than German, they are no longer illegal. What I think is most important about this is actually not that, but the way that the text describes the image. And so there's this interplay of text and image in a lot of this. And in addition to telling you about the quality of the cotton and how the zipper works really well, and it tells you it's rechtlich absolut unbedenklich, which means perfectly legal. So it's marketing the legality of this to people who are trying to toe this line of the game playing. And similarly, this is the most recent photo. This is in the image, the book galley. This is the word Hakenkreuz, swastika, with the vowels removed. Also imitating the Run DMC logo, which is another whole layer of confusion in the way the sign systems are working. But in any case, there was a legal debate at the time, this is June 2016 in Dortmund, about whether that word still is a word if the vowels are removed, right? So does it still count as a word if the vowels are removed? And eventually the legal decision was, no, it does not. It's no longer a word if the vowels are removed. So you can see the kind of game playing that goes on, right? And one of the reasons I was interested in studying these two schools is because one of them was banning all of these brands. They actually have young people sign like a code when they come in, a Hausordnung, that I forget what that is called in English, but a code, an agreement that they will not wear any of these items in school, and it's a whole list of logos, and they have to sign a form saying they won't wear it. The other school doesn't ban anything, and so one of the things I was interested in knowing was what happens, how does the banning play into this? What happens when you have when you have that kind of game playing that can result from the banning. Okay, so quickly before I end, I just want to say a little bit about what I learned from the interviews. So just a couple of quotes. So one, because initially this is just, it's fascinating and disturbing, but does it actually have any impact, right? Does it actually matter? So Martin, who self-identified as a right-wing nationalist in our interview said, quote, "When I go out, the clothes are actually really important because you won't get into a lot of events at all if you're not dressed as a right-wing person." So it grants access. It's like a ticket to be identified and get into places that you might not get into otherwise. Stefan said it helps him find people who are like-minded, and I heard a lot about this word Gleichgesinnte. You find other people who think like you. The clothing provides a group togetherness feeling, symbolism. We are one, we wear the same thing. We symbolize Torsteiner. Torsteiner symbolizes right-wing ideas. He says, well, Torsteiner was only just an example. It could also have been Lonsdale or something. Lonsdale, which I can explain later, is a co-opted brand, right? A British brand that was co-opted because when you zip the jacket up halfway, it reveals the letters NSDA in the middle of it, which evokes NSDAP, which are the letters of the Nazi Party. So not a brand that was intentionally created to send that message, but part of the coding anyway. And then finally, the brands also facilitate belonging or a sense of meaning. So Lucas, an interesting case because he got his first far-right branded clothing from his father, who he described as a more extreme person than himself. He said, you go into a bar or someplace to party, you see someone with Torsteiner clothing on, and so you think, okay, maybe I'm not so alone after all, or I'm not the only one who can't exactly identify with mainstream society. So there is a kind of way in which the clothing has this sense of connection to others as well. But as I hinted at earlier, every project has its skeptics. Mine, in the reviewer phase in particular, were predominantly focused on one question, right? How could clothing actually radicalize youth? Or as one reviewer said, won't they just grow out of it, right? And he said, actually, you know, look, I was a punk in the 80s. Isn't this just a liminal phase? Like, does this really have, aren't you just paying too much attention to this? So that was frustrating, but also helpful because I learned that I had to spend more time articulating in the book, and I added a section in the book. That reviewer was a funding reviewer, but later reviewers also asked me to try to articulate more how I think this mechanism works, that style can act as a gateway. So this will be frustrating to you because I'm not giving you the examples, but I'm going to give you the kind of summary, or if you had read the book, this is what you would see. So there are several ways in which I think style does act as a gateway to extremism, creating that kind of constitutive power for symbols. As I showed in those quotes, it establishes legitimacy, signals membership and ideology to insiders, sometimes acts as a kind of entry ticket, letting people get into places they might not otherwise, or acting as an icebreaker. There's a lot of, in fact, the chapter that got added while I was at Morphomata was on death, symbols of death, and that talks a lot about the celebration and valorization of violence for a cause, and so shows how a lot of those messages about violence and the enactment of violence can shape the way young people think. The chapter on myth talks about the way in which this kind of noble quest is, a restoration narrative is used, and even when it's not so much invoked directly, but often evoked through symbols like runic symbols, references to a sacred era, let's say. A lot of the clothing softens racist expression, particularly by evoking whiteness without mentioning race, right? And the Nordic symbols do this most clearly. The young people told me flat out again and again that Nordic is a placeholder for Aryan. It's a way of talking about whiteness without actually talking about whiteness. And so by having symbols that are these Nordic symbols, which is very unfortunate, of course, for Nordic countries as well, where I've given this talk, and it's often quite horrifying to discover how they're being misused, but that it becomes a coded way of evoking race. Of course, they desensitize and socialize consumers and peers, dehumanize victims, and a lot of the language is around resistance to mainstream society. So playing on this language of resistance and acting as a conduit of resistance. So in sum, what I argue is that these symbols do have constitutive power. They can shape identity. They strengthen racist and nationalist identification, and as a result, they can mobilize extremist action. And so they're not just clothing, they're not just derivative of other processes, but they have power that we should pay attention to and start to think about how to intervene with. So I'm going to just say thanks without saying thanks to all the folks who helped me. And of course, note that the analyses and arguments I've presented here do not represent necessarily the opinions of my funders. And we can perhaps move to whatever's next, the conversation.
Thank you for this talk. And to show you that we really mean it, before I'll even ask my first question or introduce the first topic that we're going to talk about, are there any questions from the audience that you want to ask before we start? We don't, because this is important that you also get into the conversation. There was one person, already 3 people. I don't have to work.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, very interesting. I learned quite a bit. Sir, I forget your name. When you spoke, you made references to Charlottesville, of course. And I'm wondering, Professor, are you drawing any comparisons between what's happened in the U.S. and even go back to 1977 in Skokie when the American Nazi Party attempted to march, and there were Supreme Court decisions about that, and what parallels you might draw? Thank you.
Yes, so my current project, I should say, right now I am building a database of brands that have, since I wrote this book, emerged in Russia, France, the US, the UK, and pretty much across Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Poland mostly. So I am looking at those brands and trying to compare whether they're, how are they using issues like myth differently? How are they using, are there differences and variations in depictions of violence across national contexts, or how much of this is kind of global pan-Aryanism? So on the one hand, yes, there's a systematic, again, pending funding review right now, but there's a grant proposal out if anyone from Guggenheim is in the audience. So we'll see if they fund it, or anyone else will fund it. But the, yes, I mean, one of the greatest surprises for me was to begin studying something that was a kind of niche subcultural phenomenon in another country, and then have it become, have it suddenly become much more mainstream here. And so I have more in a kind of mainstream way myself commented and analyzed a bit of the US scene. I think what we're seeing here is very much the same phenomenon of a deliberate, except here I would say is actually even more deliberate than in Germany. I think it was caught up in to some extent in brands deciding they could make a profit off of this, and it was profit driven, and sometimes it's tied to ideology, but often it's actually just brands that are making, I mean, Torsteiner is now owned by a conglomerate based in Dubai, so it is, in some cases this is just profit. There's a market there. What's happening in the US is a more deliberate call to dress in mainstream ways in order to have the ideas be listened to more seriously. So there's a more organized way to, and so that's why those khakis and polo shirts showed up in Charlottesville. That was an organized effort to look a particular way. It wasn't coincidence. And so that's, I think, but we are seeing the brands emerge here, but there is a clearer political aim to them so far.
Thank you. I'm Veronica Schott. I'm a PhD student in sociology at Columbia, and I'm interested in so sort of you going to Germany as an American scholar studying a different country and then coming back and sharing that research, and especially with view to racism and issues around, I think, race and racism. I'd be interested in your experience and how, to what extent you could use concepts from the American sociological discourse in this work, maybe bring it back, or the extent to which you couldn't. I know that's something people struggle with, and I think there's a great benefit to having outsider perspectives, because you see things. I'm German. We often don't when we're in our own, worlds. And then there's a danger, I think, of just having this one way of looking at, say, race and racism, and then plopping it onto a different context. So how did you deal with that?
I think it affects the work on multiple levels. I think on the one hand, there are ways in which I could get access and answers from youth who were what I call in and around the margins of the far right. So they weren't all active far right engaged, but they were all in environment. All of them had exposure to and significant experience, at least with a classmate or a sibling, or and knew quite a bit about the far right. I think that not just being an American, I mean, being an American who could go in and ask banal questions and ask people to explain things as an outsider, but also being white mattered, and being of German heritage myself mattered. I even had a principal in my first project, introduce me to other teachers as this is Frau Miller, ehemalige Müller, right? But I can't even say the umlaut right. You're hearing my accent, but it would, because my great-grandfather was, Müller from Essen, and so she knew that, and so it mattered to her that I had these German roots also in some way, right? That it was this that used to be Müller. I guess you guys, if you didn't speak German, you got that. So I think there are access questions, insider-outsider questions, and then I think the dialogue, the part of it, being able to be there as a faculty member for the year really helped a lot in those kind of conversations that I had. Also because we had somebody from a Nordic country there who was pretty horrified and by the Nordic symbols, and so it wasn't just a German-US dialogue, but conversations about how these symbols were being used and misused and misappropriated as well. So not sure if that answers the question, but it's many-layered.
Thank you. So obviously a lot of this is somewhat idiosyncratic to Germany, but I was sort of curious if you've gotten any understanding of the sort of transatlantic dialogue that would happen primarily through the internet channels of something like 4chan or, the sort of subcultures and how that might influence the fashion choices and how that bleeds into Germany and how Germany sort of in turn bleeds back out to the rest of the world.
So there are a couple different issues. One, when the first brand came on the market, Thorsteiner, you would see on, so you could see on American blogs, for example, people talking about like, how can I get Thorsteiner, right? So there was a market here. There were consumers who were trying to get it. People would bring it back for them when they traveled overseas. A store opened up in London while I was living in Cologne, actually, and there was chatter about that. Is anybody going to London? Can you bring it back? So there was this kind of micro market a little bit. But there's also a lot of the clothing is in English. A lot of the messages are in English. That has a legal reason for it, because it helps them circumvent bans. But it also creates markets. There are currency converters and international shipping on these websites. So they're very much trying to build a market outside of Germany. And I think some of the biggest brands have a much bigger market now in Eastern Europe and Russia than in Germany itself.
My name is Tom Main. I'm a professor at Baruch College. I just wrote a book on the rise of the alt-right in the United States. What interests me is, now I don't know if this is substantive or not, maybe it's just you looked at one thing and I looked at something else. What struck me as being one thing that was really crucial to the rise of the alt-right in the United States was the internet, right? Communication of ideas through the internet. Well, now your presentation, maybe simply because you decided I'm not going to talk about the internet, I'm going to talk about fashion, but it raises the possibility. Could it be that for some reason the internet and the exchange of ideas and forbidden communication was what precipitated the rise of the alt-right, whereas in Europe, for whatever reason, it's things and fashion, and that was the mechanism that got the word out. I don't know. I'm just bouncing that possibility off you.
So there's a couple things there. I think one thing I would say is I wouldn't say that fashion was the most important thing that drove the creation, drove the rise of the far right or drove this mainstreaming of the far right. But it's one factor that I think had been seen as only reflective of something that I think instead is partly constitutive of it, right? So I think it has a way of socializing and contributing and helping constitute identity and strengthen extremists, potentially even mobilize action in ways that hadn't been talked about here or in Europe. But I haven't thought about it, but if I had to guess which is more important, the internet or fashion, I'd probably say the internet. But I think, but I'm not ranking them in that way, right? This isn't that I'm saying this is the only thing that matters, but that this is an overlooked part, right? But certainly I do have a part in the book where I talk a little bit about the online space for selling this clothing. And I think a lot of the markets for the clothing emerged because of the internet, because they were moving beyond only one of the stores, only one of the brands, Thorsteiner, really has a strong in-person physical store base. The rest are predominantly online retailers and really relying on that. Not to mention also the way that the communication happens, and that's where the interplay of text and image. I didn't show a lot of the images where you have, because it's in German and I wasn't sure what the audience what the audience would be like in terms of speaking German, but a lot of the text on some of these websites really is instructive about what your opinion is supposed to be about migrants, right? So you're buying a t-shirt that has an anchor on it and nothing else, but then the text says, you know, we're throwing down the anchor against migrants. You know, it's time to batten down the hatches. And so you know what the meaning is because the text has told you what the meaning is, but the icon is totally irrelevant to anything normally related to the far right. So, you know, I think that's where the internet also, I mean, catalogs can do that too, but the internet is faster, and there's a lot of communication that happens in text, not just in the t-shirts.
Hi, you've mentioned a couple of times the legal response to these issues, and I have some questions about that which I hope aren't ridiculously technical. But I'm wondering, first of all, whether there's any chance to revisit this 2011 High Court decision that you mentioned. For example, is there an opportunity for the court to reverse itself or for the matter to go to the European Court of Human Rights? And also, who are the experts who are being involved in these cases? You mentioned the semioticians, and I'm curious as to what their role is as well.
I don't know. That's a great question. I will say that German legal language is the most difficult. I mean, German is already like not a super easy language, right? As we all know, in academic prose. I mean, I love the language, but it is really difficult. So I had a couple friends who are lawyers really help me kind of disentangle what these rulings look like, just because it's a really different particular kind of speech. But the 2011 High Court ruling was also reported here by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, you can follow, you know, on tracking of, you know, watchdog groups that follow how this kind of stuff happens. So I haven't heard any conversations about who the experts were. Who are these experts who advised on this? But part of it is the way that banning law works in Germany is really interesting. I mean, one of the things I did was visit a couple of people in the Verfassung, in the office, the Interior, the Office of the Protection of the Constitution, and to sort of try to figure out how banning works. And so and I think I talk about this in the book, one of the ways that banning works is symbols themselves can't be banned individually. So the swastika itself is not banned as a symbol. It's banned because it's a symbol associated with a banned organization, right? So when an organization is banned, all the symbols that are officially associated with that organization become banned. So then the question becomes, does this symbol tie back to the organization, right? And that's where the semiotic part comes in, because the decisions were that, you know, this symbol is different enough to not be the symbol that refers back to the banned organization. Does that make sense? So it's a different layer. It's not, you know, it's a more complicated way of banning symbols than just banning symbols outright. They're not banned on their own power. They're banned because of their association with banned organizations. Yeah. And I think the legal ruling around the language, it's hard to see that being reversed, in my own opinion, because it just basically the decision was a practical one, I think, which is how, you know, so what happens if it gets put into, you know, Mandarin or Japanese, like how are judges and police and authorities, you know, I mean, if you look at these photos, when you look at photos of photo after photo after photo of people at protest marches, one of the things you see is pieces of tape over parts of clothing or tattoos, right? So they'll cover up symbols that are banned. But by putting them in another language, you know, it's much harder to figure out for the authorities in the kind of surveillance and monitoring whether something is banned, right? And I think that was the practical side of the decision, is like, we can't, it's not just a semiotic decision, it's also like, how can you expect local police to know what's legal and what's not legal when it's moved into different languages?
All right, can we just, so sort of you'll have time to ask your question, right? Because I think it's a perfect moment to bring it back to something that I'm also very interested in as a literary studies person, and that is coding in itself, and semiotics, and the importance of semiotics and coding. And it was nice because there was another ambiguity in the one sort of reviewer that you talked about when you said, won't they just grow out of it? Which is for clothing, of course, extremely important, because you might also argue, no, you're just growing into it. Which is one side question that I have, is like, when do these t-shirts start with extra small and medium and large? What are the smallest kinds of...
Some of them have children's
Right, precisely, because this is the other mode, of course, in this sort of growing and growing into. But what was sort of interesting to me was that coding in your book is meant in two ways. The one is general sort of semiotics, Roland Barthes, and the coding of fashion, like Barbara Finken does in Germany, fashion as a kind of coded system. What does it mean in male and female and gender and all of that class orientation. But what you stress really strongly is that whenever you are dealing with coding, things get extremely ambiguous, right? And I think we're in a field which I would probably say is in itself a gray zone. And the kind of strategies that you mention are all strategies in a way of hatred, but also of subversion. Right? These are subversive strategies, and I would think that if Jewish people would have used the same strategies, we would all applaud them. Oh, you use these strategies, these word games, these puns against a horrifying system. And the question is sort of, how do these strategies come here? And are we, for the alt-right, really the oppressive system? So that, on the one hand, sort of what I really liked was that you make this into an extremely complicated, unfolded system rather than say, well, this means that and this symbol means that. And I also saw this in the way that you talk to the people. These 19, 18, 16-year-old people are extremely acute readers. They read these codes extremely well. And if we would all read our novels in the kind of hermeneutic intelligence that these people read T-shirts, we would all be in a better world, right? At the same time, and that was sort of the most sort of horrifying sentence in your book for me was when you said, of the 51 people who I was questioning, only one person knew what a swastika was, which is an extreme deficiency in historical awareness of what they are actually doing, right? So that you have extremely sort of nervous, in a good sense, readers, but also people who don't really know what they're doing and where they are.
Well, that was, and I should clarify, it wasn't that they didn't know what a swastika was, they didn't recognize the word swastika. Right. But they would have recognized the symbol, but the word, once it was in Danish, they didn't recognize it, which is basically in English, is so similar. So that was that they didn't recognize the symbol as a symbol, right?
Right. But I was interested then in this kind of complexification of semiotics in general and this kind of encryption, which has to do with the legal bans and all of that, that you encrypt a secret code, that you stitch this code into sort of the T-shirt in a way, which also brings me to the idea of material culture, which is extremely important in cultural studies at the moment, the importance of objects, the importance of T-shirts, of whatever, sort of objects as backgrounds to codings. Because here it's a true stitching, right? You use the material, the cotton, the good cotton.
And I refer to them in the book
cotton,
as like a walking billboard, right? It's this.
Right.
The T-shirt itself is sort of the most important item in the way. The hoodie also, but the T-shirt really carries those messages.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how do you get to this? Because normally, again, literary studies people don't think that people working in sociology are such acute semioticians, right? Because in a certain way, right? In bringing Roland Barthes into it and bringing sort of, these sort of ambiguities of language into it.
Yeah, I think. I will say, this is where it gets back to the year in Morphomata that was humbling in many ways. It's because it really was a center for the humanities. There were 10 of us there for a year and a few fellows who came in for a semester at a time. So maybe 14 people total, and only 2 of us were social scientists. The other was a sociologist who was studying graffiti in the Arab Spring. It was really interesting also. But everyone else was an art historian or a classicist or a Germanist or a comparative literature scholar, religion scholars. And, you know, so I got up there to do I spent the first 6 months too, I think, as the only social scientist. And so I got up to give my talk. We all had to give talks to each other. And I'm showing like 64 images in one talk, right? And everybody else got up to give their talks with like one image for an hour and a half, right? Right? So you could see this disciplinary difference. And, you know, I was thinking initially of the images as data points in a data set that told a story, you know, in its massive quantity. I was looking for patterns and coding them and looking for the stories that told. And these very patient humanities scholars kindly coached me to slow down. And, you know, and I mean, I remember my presentation very well, like being criticized for how many images I was showing, and like, just look at one image for a while. And they stopped me, and I would show one image and then look at the whole context, like not just the symbol, but the frame and what else is going on in the photo, and how are they interacting? What's the facial expression? What are the musculature like? What are the tattoos saying? What haircut is it? You know, so all of the context of the image. And then in the interviews, again, when I, you know, was interviewing these young people, some of it was hedging, right? So they could use the idea of the gray zone or the context to say, it could be right-wing symbol, it might not be, like that. Who knows what that really means, you know, if that person. But some of it was that they were saying you can't really interpret anything unless you have a lot of other contextual cues. And so one of the things I say is, you know, look, wear your Fred Perry shirt, like you don't know, you know, but if you see, you know, Fred Perry shirt and a whole bunch of other contextual cues, like with a whole bunch of people, and it's a photograph that was taken at a far right march, and you see, you know, and there's a bunch of things going on, you can probably make a reasonable guess, right? So you can make a reasonable guess that that's being worn in that way. It's further complicated by the counter, you know, so Lonsdale is a good example. Lonsdale that got co-opted, you know, what Lonsdale, the brand, was very upset by this. And so they launched an anti-racist campaign and put money into funding anti-racist groups and funding kind of initiatives to work with soccer youth and all kinds of things to try to, you know, to combat the far right. So after a while, the left kind of said, well, why are we still letting the far right wear this shirt? We should support Lonsdale, and we should be wearing it. So then, you know, groups from the left started wearing the brand and the shirt to support Lonsdale. So, you know, you don't really know, right, who's, you know, is this person wearing it for this reason, or are they wearing it to support the anti-racist campaign? You know, it's this kind of idea that it's like the, you know, Pepe the Frog, another bizarre, you know, case of semiotic co-opting and co-optation. You know, there are people say, like, well, if we just reclaimed it, right? Can you reclaim symbols once they get co-opted? And I think, you know, so you just don't really know. And I think you have to be really confident in the use of multiple contextual cues in order to interpret anything in any particular way. But there are, you know, there are cases where you're on a train, you know, and there's enough contextual cues that you probably get a pretty good sense. And then sometimes you just see the logo, you know, the logo of the brands is pretty clear too, sometimes.
Another question I would have concerns the notion of myth, which is extremely important. And I think it operates in a way sort of against the kind of complexification we have talked about up until now, because when you read Roland Barthes, he's constantly saying that myth makes complex things easy, or it purports to say that, you know, sort of things are actually easy, and myth politically basically immobilizes culture and therefore is unpolitical, because politics are contingent and they can go into different ways, and myth wants to basically keep the status quo and say the status quo is natural. Like white supremacy is a natural thing, and I can show you the mythical context to that. And I found very interesting when you read Roland Barthes again that he says myth statistically is on the right. And he would probably say today, statistically, myth is on the alt-right, right? Not only the right, but the alt-right. And the question is, how do you read that kind of, on the one hand, extremely complex semiotics, and on the other hand, the simplification that mythical symbols, runes, the North, historically extremely complicated also. You know, so how did the North become that? Why is white and north related, and the north, political north, also against the south in a way? So how do you read that kind of weird meeting in the alt-right of simplification and immobilization on the one hand, and then all these mobile strategies and ambiguous sort of semiotics?
Well, I think the use of myth is what drew me to the project initially, because by far the most ubiquitous set of symbols and iconography and evocative script is the Nordic myths across these brands. They are overall, and so that's a lot of what drew me to it, is trying to figure out what is the fascination, and what I mostly focus on is what I call sacred origin narratives or sacred origin myths, which are these myths that populations or groups of people hold onto as some kind of story about a sacred geography that belongs to them and is infused with meaning. The far right does it, but so does the caliphate, right? This idea of a restoration, a return to something that we're going to, that ISIS wants to see a contribution to. So it's a powerful recruitment tool. And a powerful mobilization tool for extremism across the spectrum. And I think because it has this idea of restoration, of heroic contribution, and this is where it gets into the emotions that I talk about in the book, that you'll see words like brotherhood, togetherness, loyalty, integrity, trust, those kinds of words on the clothing, right? I mean, these emotional, aspirational traits that are associated with being a good nationalist man in particular, right? So they're also infused with like elements of masculinity and what it means to be a real national man. And that comes across in the clothing, in the messages, and in the text that's selling the clothing. And that's part of that whole restoration to some fantastical idea of a better time, a better place, a better era, a way we can make this place great again. Let's just say, these ideas that there was some way to get back somewhere, some way to get to something better, and that you have a role to play in it. You have a heroic contribution to make, and I think that is a way of offering a sense of belonging and offering a sense of meaning to people who may not feel that sense of meaning or belonging in other places.
Is that then the real script that is being transported by all these complex, could you just always say north?
Yeah, right.
And that will be it?
I mean, it's evocative, right? And I think that's part of it's important to understand a lot of this message as evocative rather than directly, invoking something, that it plays on emotions that are so deeply rooted that people might not even understand themselves why they respond to them. And so just saying north, yes, there's also probably strategic there. They're using it as ways of coding, of ways of saying things like softening racist speech, but it also is this kind of evocative adventure even, right? You see a lot of horizon gazing, a lot of like staring off into the distance in the catalog, right? These kind of sense of something meaningful afoot, and you're going to be a part of it. Right?
Before we get again to sort of, to you guys to ask questions, I was just wondering, because that reminded me sort of the idea that and that's also something I found important, is that for you, the people who do these things and who wear these clothes are not simple, right? They're highly complex, and it's not that it's just, in a way, economic fears that they have, and therefore they are all right or whatever, because it's what you would call a kind of a deterritorialized notion that in global times there's no more home. There's no more space that is in any way sort of a kind of a territory that they would have for themselves and for their lives. And so that in that sense, sort of, groups take over that kind of function of territory. And also these myths, as you say, because they're myths of place and space that take over these kind of borders that everybody feels are, you know, sort of opening up too much, so a wall would be good. You know, and that would make things less complicated and easier again. And that is, of course, when these myths sort of come in and say, I'm here, and I will do it for you, in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I think the moment that surprised me most in the interview was when like a 17 or 18-year-old construction trainee used the word Verkörperung, which is embodiment, right? To talk about the way he felt wearing this clothing, that it embodied a sense of violence or power, and it made him feel stronger. And, you know, that kind of went against any stereotype I had in my head about, you know, I mean, it was sophisticated, complex, and captured exactly what I think a lot of them were feeling, which is, this makes me feel more powerful, it makes me feel stronger, it makes me feel a part of something. And so I think, first of all, there's that. The consumers themselves are not just hapless, you know, racist idiots, but that they're attracted to it for particular reasons. But I also think we have underestimated here in the States, you know, the power that the mainstreaming itself of style and fashion has in softening racist expression and softening what extremist ideas are. And I think that's what the alt-right figured out, and in its call to show up looking mainstream in Charlottesville, and that call went out over a blog that, and the head of that blog said, you know, the way we look is more important than our ideas in getting people to listen to us. And so I think that you know, those things are very much intertwined, the way that we interpret what someone is saying, and even the language that they're using, which has been softened as well. But, you know, the way we interpret what someone is saying, when it doesn't fit the picture we have in our heads of what a white supremacist looks like, let's say. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing in the danger of this mainstreaming, is that it seems like, won't they just grow out of it, right?
Yeah, I can't even read this at the moment, but when we came here from Brooklyn today, we saw a couple of school kids, and they were all wearing, of course, khakis and polo shirts because it's school uniform, right? And this is extremely scary because they don't know. Obviously, so sort of, but they wear it, and it's almost the opposite, that, you know, sort of these older alt-right people prey on kids in school uniforms, you know, like vampires, basically, sort of waiting for them to recognize themselves in the older people, right? Okay, but I promise this sort of. I'm sure you have a second round of questions.
Given the multitude of threats to the survival of humanity and the different threats to the continuation of healthy societies, I'm not clear what concrete danger this phenomenon poses, and if you were able to elicit from your interviews any concretely expressed long-term aspirations of these people, you know, for themselves and society.
Well, I think, you know, what I argue in the book is that it's a gateway, right? So that there are many different gateways. We've talked for a long time about far-right rock music and the music scene as being a gateway because lyrics are anti-Semitic or racist or nationalist, and that a lot of young people historically have talked about music as being a gateway. And what I'm trying to argue is that style is also a gateway. And so, meaning, you know, it may not be the ideology alone that is initially what attracts young people into these far-right movements, but that they can be drawn in and socialized in part by participating in a subculture that helps shape those opinions as they enter it. So, you know, it's only one part of a bigger story about how the far-right is growing, and this is separate from the political parties. This is the subcultural scene dimension of it. This is separate from, you know, the political parties making their way into parliaments or into governments. These are not formal organized social movements that I'm studying. I'm studying youth who hang out around and in and around clubs and parties and talk to bouncers and get in. the concrete danger is that it socializes them, it dehumanizes victims, it gets them access into scenes where they're exposed to greater ideology, it draws them into a world of far right that valorizes violence, that celebrates violence, that finds their images of nooses, for example, that they would laugh at, right? That makes light of atrocities against Muslims, against Jews historically, and against African Americans in the States. That codes and in an amusing way that uses humor and fun and game playing to create this sense of resistance against adult society. So I think that's kind of how I would sum it up.
Now, I'm curious, like most of the people you quoted, I mean, I think actually all of them were men, and the fashion photos we saw, as well as the documentary photos from marches, were also mostly men, and this is what I mostly associate with these ideas. I think we saw one image of a woman wearing like a white sort of sweatshirt that said something babe or so. I thought that was interesting. That was an English word, the only English word I can think of right now. And I'm just wondering, like, of the people you interviewed, like how many were women, and were there, what they said, was that different in any way from what the men said? And also, what are the fashion options for women in this context?
Yeah. So
Lacy kind of thing.
Yeah, I chose, in order to get access to youth who were, who I thought would be able to be good informants about the clothing and explain things to me, I knew that I could get access to youth like that through construction schools. And construction schools are overwhelmingly male. So there was a sampling issue in like how I got access to young people that meant that I didn't get access to very many women. I did get to interview two young women, but it's not enough to really say anything definitively about that. They did have some interesting things to say. The clothing itself is, I think you could find a parallel if you went to, there may be spaces where you can get greater access to women in and around the scenes, but they are heavily male scenes. The clothing is heavily marketed to men. There are women's lines. They're much smaller. The iconography is less violent. And even sometimes when you have the same shirt sold, so there's a shirt that uses a phrase that says sort of, like ready for contact and adventure or something like that. And on the men's shirt, the iconography behind that text is spattered blood. And on the women's shirt, it's puckered red lips. So it's a sexualized image, right? And so sexualized iconography. So you get kind of a different, you get even in those instances where there is women's clothing, you kind of start to see what the positioning is. Women, of course, come up a lot in the mobilization of action in the movement, because the protection of women is often used as an excuse, as an ignition point in these kinds of riots and rallies that get started through rumors, often even. But so it's not that they're ignored, but that and certainly the violence and much of the participation in the movements are and in these scenes are men. Yeah.
I was also I was also wondering about sort of whether this gendering, which is seems extremely important, is also traversed by something else, which I think probably, and that leads me to the question of whether the hegemonic body of the West today is an alt-right body, and that would mean that it has to do not only with gender, but with what we would call sort of hard bodies. Because there was this one example where like a little scrawny guy sort of was saying, I really can wear this T-shirt. You got to go to the gym. I have to go to the gym, and then I can wear it, and then I become powerful. I'm just independent music, or whatever kind of, I can't do it. So that even probably but I don't know, for the females, it's a question of what kind of body you have, not whether you're female, but whether you're strong, white, and sort of hard in that way, which is of course also something that the Nazis wanted to have. So the whiteness, the hardness, hard as steel, Kruppstahl, whatever. You have all these sort of histories and connotations.
Yeah, there's a whole lot. In fact, there are, the brands have their own kind of Instagram, pages and social media feeds, some of which get shut down from time to time, but a lot of those are consumed with images of people posing in the clothing or in the gym with the clothing. I mean, the body part of this is huge, is a really big part of it. And that, I would say, was the other thing that really surprised me the most in the interviews, I would say, is how much these young men talked about their bodies, and I just didn't expect it, I just didn't expect that it mattered so much, and how much it mattered to them what kind of clothing they wore, and they would look at pieces of clothing, as you said, and say, oh, I could never wear that, my shoulders aren't broad enough, and that image is meant for someone with broader shoulders, right, to highlight the muscles there or something, and just, really matter of fact, thinking about their bodies a lot more than I expected them to. And I think that's something that absolutely has to be, and it's clearly tied both historically and across national contexts to this idea of fitness and the fit nation and the body of the nation and healthy bodies and what that means to be a good national and a good nationalist. As tied to fitness. And you see that here too in calls to show up physically fit, show up looking in particular ways.
My question has to do with where the clothes are manufactured and if that's part of the dialogue.
Yeah. So I don't know where they are all manufactured. That's a good question. But I will say that when Torsteiner was sold to that conglomerate based in Dubai, there was a big uproar about it among consumers, and so there's this discussion about should we still be supporting this company? Well, it's still, all kinds of questions. It didn't seem to hurt the bottom line too much, as far as I can tell, but it was something that came up. But it's not the kind of thing that seems to be discussed very widely among the consumers, ironically, although it's, because the messaging is, I guess, more important than the actual cause. But I actually didn't look into that. That's a good question. I will look that up.
Yeah, so could you talk about the conceptual bounds that you kind of created when entering into the social space? So not kind of the argument in the book, but kind of your approach as a social scientist. Into the interviewing space, or can you say a little more? More broadly. So, yeah. I don't know. It's in your PowerPoint. I think that you said you called it a social space. So, I kind of understood that as the far right dynamic within Germany. So I was just wondering how you kind of created bounds in conceptualizing that.
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly, what I think what you're asking is about this distinction between kind of looking at the cultural and social and emotional spaces as opposed to kind of structural and ideological ones. Does that sound?
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, I want to make sure I'm addressing the question that you want to hear, but what I was interested in is there. It's also this distinction between studying youth who are kind of at the core of movements or the core of extremist groups versus those on the margins. And so two things I was interested in is, there is a lot of work with youth, either intervention work with youth who are kind of seriously at risk for or engaged in the extreme right, also being recruited as foreign fighters. There's a lot of efforts in Germany and elsewhere to kind of prevent those kinds of recruitments from happening, and also working with youth who have dropped out. They're called exiters from these scenes. But we haven't paid as much attention to youth who I think of as kind of on the margins, who maybe move in and out in more fluid ways into scenes. And I think that's one of the things this clothing enables them to do more easily than they would if they were in the uniform of the racist skinhead from the 90s and 2000s, where they can maybe go to a party where they have some youth there are other youth who are there who are far right, but then they go back to the workplace and they're not in that space, right? So they kind of move in and out, sometimes over the course of a weekend, sometimes even during the interview, right? Into saying things that are far right and then not, right? They contradicted themselves a lot, I guess is what I'm saying. And so conceptually, I was really interested methodologically in trying to understand those youth at that moment, who I see as youth who are most reachable in terms of interventions and working through the school system, of how can we reach those youth? How can we understand how they're at a moment where they could go this way or they could go that way? And then I'm also interested in understanding, this doesn't just happen by showing up at a meeting or joining a group formally and signing up on a membership line, but these kind of more cultural and social spaces. There's been work on the hooligan scene in soccer, there's been work on music, but these other ways that youth and young people's social lives enable them to move ideologically in a certain kind of trajectory, I think is a really interesting place to study. And so but like I said, it wasn't like I set out, if this is a methodological question, it's not like I set out and said, this is what I'm going to do. I was following something that I had to figure out, right? It was a puzzle.
Just ask really quickly, I guess one thing that I was thinking about was, I don't know if you kind of gleaned any geographical differences in terms of who's involved in this community, not necessarily geographically like east-west, but like urban, non-urban.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to look at scaffold builders is because scaffold builders are a really interesting group. There are only a few places in Germany where you can train to be a scaffold builder, and as a result, they have residential components to their training. So in Berlin, scaffold builders come for 6-week residential stays and live in a dormitory and go to the vocational school for 6 weeks intensively and then go back to their job site, whereas ordinarily apprentices will spend 3 days a week at their work site and 2 days a week in school. So as a result, there were other reasons to focus on scaffold builders. Based on what I had studied previously, I knew that they had higher risk youth, higher risk occupation for far-right engagement, but I oversampled from them because they also in this school meant I was getting youth who were coming from other places throughout Germany. So these were not just youth who were in Berlin, but they were from other parts. That said, there's not enough in the sample for me to say whether there was, whether there were, whether you can say urban versus rural, There are other folks studying kind of demographic differences in Germany who trace the attitude surveys pretty well and support for political parties pretty well. So we do know that there is some small town component to this, that there's stronger support in certain regions.
Is there qualitative research for that as well? Because I know it would obviously, it would be very easy to figure out who votes for whom, but.
In German or in English? There's a lot of German scholars working on this that I'm happy to send links to. English language, qualitative research on Germany. I don't know, Virag, do you have any suggestions on this topic? There may be scholars in the room who can recommend. There are some. There are a few anthropologists I can think of, but I'm happy to follow up by email and send you a couple ideas. Yeah, and there's some they're really good doctoral students, actually, a couple of them that I can also refer you to working there.
I'm afraid we only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, please. Sorry.
On this side, one on that side. Highest arm. Yes.
Hi. I have so many thoughts about this. I remember when you first started exploring this idea, and I remember thinking, gosh, that sounds really interesting. It's such a weird, niche area that I don't know how many people are going to be interested in it. And now fast forward all these years later, and it feels so relevant, and it's really exciting to have seen it take on this life. And I think that your point about, we look at branding, and since you started this project, branding and the marketing of brands has just taken off and exploded. I mean, now we're having a conversation. Do you go out and buy more Nike or do you burn your Nike, right? And it's, so even if it doesn't have a message on it, you're sending a message with the brand that you are wearing. So to further that and to bring back the conversation about the internet, this feels like the kind of book that, in further editions, you're going to have to just keep adding chapters. What's going on with social media and the conversations around censorship on social media of really extreme ideals? And are they aware? Does Instagram, Facebook/Instagram, Do they know that there are pictures, no doubt, being shared all over the place of people wearing this clothing? And do you know if there are any actions that are being taken by these companies to address that?
Yes. Thank you, Claire, who, along with this other group of mamas back there, or my guides on the playground about whether this was crazy to take my kids to Germany to pursue this obsessive project over a decade. Yes, first of all, this took me down a rabbit hole around consumption and branding that was really, really fascinating, aside from even these issues. And I think one of the things I learned is that, and if there are any marketers in the room or folks who work in advertising, a lot of this is not news. The things I'm saying about brands constituting identity and, consumption driving identity. I mean, I compare this. I did find some research, and again, Virag, I keep pointing to you, but you did some work with Michelle Lamont on African American identity and consumption, and how consumption can strengthen identity. Buying, Black-supported business, Black-owned businesses, I think was the article. But then there was also a project on, buying green, right? So if you're an eco-consumer, do you feel more green, right? So this idea that like certain kinds of consumption can strengthen your identity is something that I think marketing specialists and advertisers have long known, right? That social scientists haven't, at least in sociology and scholars of cultural studies, haven't really spent as much time on. So that's the first thing I would say, is that this is partly it's our failure of interdisciplinarity to have those conversations with folks in the business school who probably, this is old news. And second, I would say on social media, yes. I mean, the latest so I'm writing a paper with a doctoral student or a master's student right now on the social media of these brands across 6 countries, and everything's been shut down except for this Russian Facebook-like group called vKontakte, which is, I guess, one of the most popular European social media platforms. So they've all moved over to that, and that is still a place where the social media feeds can thrive. But I think, there are iterations of it that they get kicked off platforms and then come back in different forms, or somebody else creates a YouTube channel that is kind of a private YouTube channel that's sharing them, but it's not officially owned by the brand. So there's a lot happening in the social media space that I'm just starting to scratch the surface of, that is very much, I think, part of this interplay between text and image and brand and message that we haven't really fully investigated.
Final question.
Okay, we'll make it a good one. All right. So we've talked a lot about gray zones and the idea that part of what is so interesting to think about with these images, with clothing, with branding, with the Lonsdale case in particular, right, is that nobody really knows what's going on. There's so much ambiguity. So I'm thinking about, in this whole conversation, the move of the right wing to adopting and embracing that gray zone, that ambiguity. I'm thinking about Steve Bannon. I'm thinking about the alt-right and the ways in which it gained power, in part because it was a bit ambiguous and unknown, not just on the internet, but also that gray zone aspect to it. So I was wondering if you could had any comments about like the gray zone and why we have to think about that. And then as I was thinking about that question, I had a subsidiary question, which is about thinking about social science and the ways in which we think about social science. Always, so much of the traditions are about concrete knowledge, singular truths, objectivity, etc. And then humanities and your exposure to that in thinking about, subjectivity, postmodernism, multiple interpretations. And so the ways in which social science perhaps has to evolve in order to think about something like the power of these gray zones and the power of the right wing.
That was a good question, Don. You did a good job. So the gray zones, one of the things I'll say about gray zones, the other way people talk about this sometimes is as dog whistles, right? That there's like a strong intentionality to these messages that are only supposed to be heard by people who understand them, or that can be heard in certain ways, and others will just not catch on and not recognize them. And I think there's 2 different ways that happens. One, I think the gray zone is in that way an intentional strategy, both in the clothes, but it's intentional because it also helps them make a bigger profit. And that's, we can't separate that, right? There's this whole other set of consumers for a lot of these brands that are, you probably read this part, the bikers, right? So there's this, in the Nordic Myths chapter they talk a lot about like, well, it could be a biker who likes that, because the bikers, they like Nordic symbols too, right? There's this kind of, there's this sort of called the motorcycle bikers, right? There's these sort of subcultures that also like, and then sometimes some of those subcultures also intersect with the far right. So there's different layers of gray zones and ways in which some of the brands are actually deliberately doing that to have a bigger market. They want more consumers. And sometimes it's to evade bans, and sometimes it's, just to be able to be provocative and communicate to insiders without sharing that information to outsiders. So I think the gray zone is a way of thinking about, has multiple functions all at once. And certainly I think that contributes to making things more appealing in mainstream speech, because it enables a kind of safety in saying things that are offensive by always having a way of saying that's not what I meant, right? Or that's not...
Like Trump.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I think not so much Trump, because I think he just says what he means, but I think there are people he surrounds himself with who will use the gray zone more. I think he actually doesn't use the gray zone that much. I think he's the one who sets up the others to use the gray zone and for people to know what it means. So that's what I would say, is that there's an interplay. But I think on the second question, it was methodological. Yes, I mean, I've always been an interdisciplinary, so I've trained as a sociologist, but then spent most of my career, primary appointments in an ed school, so I've always been around other interdisciplinary scholars, but pretty much social science oriented. There was an odd historian and philosopher in the department once or twice, but, not big groups. But I do think that I learned quickly in Morphomata, working intensely with a group of humanities scholars, that there are tools that humanities-trained scholars have, that they've been applying to a lot of aspects of social life, or lots of aspects of material culture that maybe those of us who study more contemporary social life should be using more. And probably is a scary thought for a lot of humanities scholars who might worry about us using them sloppily, and without, by using 64 images in a row instead of one. But I think that dialogue needs to happen.
As a closing remark, we'll have, in a way, a sequel to this event on October 2nd, where we'll talk about what happened in Chemnitz, the horrible situation that evolved from this March demonstration. And I think that, in a way, ties into that lady's question, well, what does this mean? Does this really pose any danger? And this is, in a way, the next step, that, violence, eruption of horrible hate speech, and so forth. So if you want to be further depressed or more severely depressed, come back on October 2nd, and we'll have the Consul General from the Consulate here in New York speak, and Steve Sokol from the American Council on Germany, and Christian Martin, a wonderful political scientist here. But I want to thank you, Cynthia, thank you, Hanjo, thank you, Eva, Heiko. Thank you so much for this insightful dialogue, and thank you for contributing and thinking about this further. Thank you.